If you saw this 1x2 on the shelf at a box store and you needed a 1x2, you probably wouldn't buy this one because of that knot, right? Because that's what a knot does. A knot is a hole in the board. Can you see that? That this knot behaved in pretty much exactly the same way that this hole would behave. We're going to talk about 5 or 6 or 7 defects that you better know about before you go down and lay down your cash. And one of those defects is invisible. All right, so not every knot is a deal killer, believe it or not. If this knot would have been in the middle of a 2x4, you would have still had, you know, 1 1/4 inches on each side, which would have been enough for the board to work as a stud or maybe as a small ceiling joist. So don't freak out at every knot. But let me show you a knot that probably is almost always worth rejecting the board. And that's a knot that's going through the edge of the board. It's called a spike knot. You got 2 spike knots here. And can you see that one fell out? That if this one fell out, there would be nothing left of that board. And eventually, almost every spike knot's going to do something fatal. Let me show you this. This is a piece of red cedar. This is a fencing board. And that spike knot went clear across the board. Can you see that there was, what is that, 1/2 inch by 1 inch? And there was 3/4 of a square inch of lumber holding that board. That spike knot wrecked it. Watch for spike knots and leave that in the stack for the next guy. So when we're talking about lumber, I'm talking about 2 species here today, Douglas fir and western red cedar. And part of being a consumer of wood products is knowing enough about the species to know what species that's available is going to be the one that you need to use for the application. This is a fence board. That knot, almost a spike knot, almost a through knot, big enough that you might just not want to put that up on your fence. Still, there are times and places when you can cut around the knots and have plenty of usable lumber and go home with a board that is going to work fine if you're going to cut it up. So don't forget about the short pieces you got to make when you're picking through for the boards that you want to buy. Now, we're coming into a whole new category of defect here, and that is pitch in Douglas fir. I'm going to imagine that southern yellow pine has pitch. All sorts of coniferous trees around here have pitch. It's the sap, it's the blood, it's the juice. And sometimes it runs right out of the end of the log, and sometimes it gets on your hands. In this case, you see that dark color? That is wood fiber that is completely impregnated with pitch. The pitch is soaked right in. And that doesn't really change the strength of that wood right there, maybe, but it doesn't help it. And pitch seams often delaminate the wood fibers to where the board just isn't joined at all where the pitch is. Now let me show you why it is that you can go into a Cabela's catalog or, I don't know, Land's End or any of the other outfitting store catalogs and buy something called fat wood. This is an example of fat wood in Douglas fir. So I'm going to carve a little piece of this fat wood out of here just to show you something. And it's this, that the reason it's called fat wood is it likes to burn. Look at that. And not only does it burn, but it'll boil out of there and it'll drip back down onto you. There's a reason they poured pitch off the ramparts onto the bad guys. You pour burning pitch. Now, pitch is not a big deal if it's just burning and you're starting a campfire, but if it's bleeding out of a nice beam, that a beautiful beam in your great room, and you see a little stringer of amber-colored pitch, and you wipe it off and you chisel it off, and your painter heals it up, and a year later it's right back there again. I don't know if I can even blow this out. Yeah. Pitch is a thing. And one more bit of trivia, if you're working and you get pitch on your hands, butter. Butter takes it right off and you can keep moving. But pitch is a defect. It's a defect and you got to watch for it when you're buying lumber. Okay, so if you look at this board, you pull this out of the stack, number 2, KD, HT, yeah, okay. Yeah, not bad, right? A little bit of wane. That's where the bark was, the circumference, and wane can be a defect if it's excessive, but that doesn't hurt one thing. And the board is straight, and you load it up in your cart, and you take it home, But if you didn't look all the way down to the end, let's get it right in here. This, my friends, is a knot cluster. That is as spectacular a knot cluster as this old unreconstructed logger has ever seen. I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 knots in half a square foot. That might be a new record. But here's the thing. You got, on an 8-foot board, you got 12 bad inches. Take it home, cut it off, put that in your stove, or let your kid try to drive a nail into that board, because you can't hardly drive a nail there any place, and as soon as you do, it's going to break. Knot clusters are fun to look at and miserable to work with. All right, I got 3 or 4 more to cover, including the invisible defect that we'll talk about at the end. But leading up to that, now you're not going to see this very often, this exact thing. This is bugs. This is wood maggots. Wood maggots are a type of a beetle that lays an egg and it hatches, and the larva eats its way through all kinds of species. If you see evidence of bugs or rot, well, if it's a kiln-dried board, the larva is dead. If it's not a kiln-dried board, and you buy something with the larva in there and you nail it up, when it hatches, it doesn't care if it stays in the original board. He's going to mine right out of that first board into any other wood that he can chew and digest. So in general, if you see frass, which is what bugs and ants leave after they chew and pass the wood through, if you see anything that looks like there's a bug in there, you know what? Yeah, pass on that. Rot in general is an obvious defect that some people can overlook. All right, let's talk about heart center. Right there is a heart center off on the corner, the extreme corner of a 6x6 beam. In this case, you can ignore the heart center because the check, you see that split that runs out from the heart, the pith to the closest side, didn't hurt anything. Now, if that heart was bullseyed, if that was a bullseye heart, not only is the check going to go to one side or another, but the whole piece will rotate around that heart. If you see a twisted board, I will bet you a pretty darn good steak dinner that the twist is rotating around a heart center. There are several variations from straight, right? Because crooked is a defect in and of itself. You got twist, you got cup, you got bow, you got crown. All of these are different ways of talking about crooked lumber. We did a video on that when I was building the spec house. You might want to check that out. But a good sawyer, like Matthew Brady on my old mill, will carefully cut the heart out. You see that? The heart was right there, and it went out to sawdust. That's paying attention to your work. And you can see right here that the pith was bisected right down the whole length of the board, which means it's not going to damage it. Same thing right there, same thing. You see that? The heart was right there, he cut it out. If you see a heart in the middle of a 2x4, yeah, unless you're building a prop for a boat, see that? Heart center is a defect. It's not a fatal defect, but it's a defect. So this board, if you just walked up to it, doesn't look too bad. I mean, the planer skipped. This is rough, so what? Nobody cares about that. You got a pretty good check down on the other end. The knots are not excessive, so you might just load it up, and that's why you got to look at both sides of every board. Because when you flip this over, wow, the knots are worse, and the checks are on both ends. Look at that. There's a split back here, 30 inches. There's a big, bad split down there, 4 feet. Reject, unless you got a table saw, because you wouldn't have any trouble sawing this into a 2x4 and a 2x6 that you get for the price of a reject 2x10. That's a trick. If you've got a table saw, you can save defect lumber and make something that not only can you use, but you can be glad to use it. All right, so here's the one that's invisible. It's not exactly a defect. And then I'll follow this up. I know I told you this was the last one, but the last one is going to be life safety issues around defects in boards. But whether or not a board is kiln dried, the moisture content, like I say, it's not a defect, it's just part of the process of the wood. Where in the log to lumber process did the board come out of the process and get into your possession? Sometimes green lumber, S-dry, as it's called here, is just fine. Now the moisture content for framing lumber I think is supposed to be at or below 18%. Somebody straighten me out on that. But in general, a green board is just fine until you leave it in the sun. And then when the moisture goes out of it, the characteristics of the stresses in the board are going to manifest, and it's probably not going to stay straight. So green lumber is not a defect. Green lumber that is poorly dried becomes a defect as it deviates from straight. Now, the life safety issue revolves around whether or not you or somebody else up off the ground walk on a board that has a defect in it. It gets us back to the first rule of framing. You never walk on anything you didn't build yourself. Now that's not practical, but you don't put a board with defects like knot clusters or big checks or spike knots, especially not spike knots, in a scaffold situation. I don't care if you're just throwing a 2x6 between the walls on a hallway, so you don't have to jump from one side of the hall plate to the other. If it's got a spike knot, you cut it in half and get it on the ground, because if you don't put it up there, somebody else might. And you think, well, if it breaks, I'll just reach out and grab something and I'll stop my fall and then lower my... No, when it breaks, you're on the ground too quick to respond. So lumber defects are simply education and disappointment unless somebody falls. Keep it in mind, pay attention, cut around the knots. There's always going to be a place for a short board, but the best thing you can do for yourself is learn to identify the knots and the defects and the characteristics of the lumber where you live that might just make it unsuitable for what you're building. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.